And so I'm going to touch briefly on 3 points, which will actually build upon much of what Sarah and Xiao have alluded to. And I'd start with the first point, which is that the authorities in China, as we've heard, make a priority of controlling information and ensuring alternative points of view are sidelined within China. And the crackdown to this end has intensified over the last years. This is, I would note, part of a broader pattern that's visible in many parts of the world, and especially so in other repressive settings, including in places like Russia and Iran. But I think what's important to recognize is that as regimes like the one in China has become more active internationally, it's actually had an impact on the integrity of information systems and freedom of the media internationally, including within democratic societies. And I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, why would a regime that works with such purpose at home to manage and suppress free expression do otherwise beyond its borders? And I think what we're seeing is that to the extent circumstances permit, the Chinese authorities and those working with them try to put off limits issues that they themselves feel are out of bounds, even within democratic societies. And I'd note it was 4 years ago this month that this sort of issue was brought into focus when it was a visit, I believe, to Ottawa by China's foreign minister, and a Canadian reporter sought to ask a question and was scolded by the Chinese foreign minister at the time. And I think it brought into relief the mindset that the Chinese authorities bring to these sorts of issues. And if anything, since that time, we've seen even more of this sort of effort to curb speech beyond China's borders on issues that the Chinese authorities feel are out of bounds. And so within Canada, to use this example, there have been concerns raised about the Chinese government's impact on the expression of Chinese Canadians. And this, I think, is part of a pattern we've seen in any number of countries, one that's quite disturbing. I think as we think about how to address these issues, my colleagues and I at the International Forum for Democratic Studies have been working on a series of papers looking at different aspects of the challenge that's emerged to free speech, both in the university setting, in the media setting, and elsewhere. And we've had some really terrific analysts take a close look at this, including Edward Lucas, who's looked at the issue in the context of the journalistic and media realm. Martin Halle has looked at the ways in which investment from China has non-economic costs and can repurpose democratic institutions for non-democratic ends. And the most recent paper we've released is authored by Glenn Tiffert of the Hoover Institution, who looked at how intellectual inquiry is being curbed by the CCP in a whole host of settings, many of which are in open societies. And I think, if anything, the pandemic is going to deepen the vulnerabilities that these institutions face, either because it'll be more difficult to raise money philanthropically in the university context, or the economic situation will become more fraught for independent news media, which has been the case for years and years around the world in so many settings. And it's worth noting that as independent media has been stretched around the world, Chinese state investments in media, both through the outlets that Sarah alluded to, such as Xinhua and CGTN, but through a range of other media outlets and instruments, has grown considerably. And in so many settings now, there is a far more significant presence of Chinese state or Chinese state-aligned media than there was certainly a decade ago. And this is happening concurrently with the stress that's being placed on independent media, including in fragile democracies. And one of the things that the reports we've released earlier this year has found is that we really need to think hard about how to strengthen the resilience of independent media generally, but also in the context of settings where Chinese state media is making inroads as a way to both shape public discussion in these settings, but also to exclude from the discussion issues that the Chinese authorities deem to be off limits. And finally, let me just say a word about the issue of technology. It's really not possible to discuss the challenge we face in the globalization era and in the era of the globalization of censorship without taking into account the increasing importance of technology and how people understand the world around them, how opinions are formed, and how we communicate with each other. I think as we proceed through the pandemic, we're seeing we're really being stretched. On the one hand, we're relying on technology more than ever. At the same time, we haven't really built the norms around the technology that can ensure we can stimulate a race to the top when it comes to free expression, the transparency of information, and the integrity of it, rather than a race to the bottom, which will privilege the manipulation of information, opacity, and censorship and surveillance. And I think this is something that really needs to be prioritized. On this count, I'd commend our audience to really a first-rate article that Xiaochang wrote in the January 2019 issue of the Journal of Democracy, looking at these issues. I think just coming back to conclude to a point that Sarah made with respect to the rapid advances that China has made in the use of technology for domestic purposes. And I'd really stress the point that the innovations that are being incubated at the domestic level in China in an era of globalization are now being migrated beyond China's borders, such that the platforms, the tools, the systems that many countries are adopting in a wide variety of settings, ranging from authoritarian countries around the world, but also to democracies as far afield as Latin America, to sub-Saharan Africa, to Southeastern Europe, and elsewhere, are now starting to adopt technologies that may not have the sort of standards and norms wrapped around them that are likely to enrich and enhance democratic accountability. On the contrary, and I think to the extent that China's authorities have gained a running start, in part because of some assumptions that we all had about the extent of the benefits of integration and the mutual benefits of integration have to be rethought so that this is not simply unconditional engagement in these spheres where human rights and democratic accountability are central, but instead that we have principled engagement on these counts that ensure democratic and human rights values are put front and center. And I just conclude by saying that given the stakes involved for all of us, it's really imperative that we strengthen our resilience in the face of an advancing authoritarian tide. It's led by China and the censorship and control that comes along with it.